Hey, in this section, we are going to be looking at how we can apply different orders to the elements of the page. And then also, if we have different page element heights, then how we can apply using Flex and add different spacing to the elements using the justify content property. And also looking at align items and align content and the different values that can be applied to those and how that they're going to space out the child elements once they get applied to the page content. Places where we want the content, so whether we want it to be spaced between or spaced evenly, we can redistribute how the content is being displayed. There's also some options where we can align the items and align the content as well. So all of these can work together in order to fine-tune the positioning and the spacing of the elements. We're going to use the same flex.html file as we did in the first one, and we're just going to link to another style sheet. So that's going to be flex2css, and then we're going to save this as flex2 within the same root directory. So we want to keep the main container still to have the flex, and we'll keep the wrap as well. We're going to get rid of the flex direction. And then for the elements within the main parent, this is where we're going to apply some flex sizing. So with the sizing, you do have some options on how the size of the content that you want within the main container. So for each one of the items, what type of sizing that you want for the items. And these are the properties of the children. So by default, they're laid out depending on whatever the source code order is, but you can actually change the order of the items. So let's say, for instance, we want element 1 and we want to change the order of element 1. Let's apply a different order to it. So we know we've got 8 items in there, and we're going to put that within order number 3. So that's updating where element 1 is now showing up, and it's being added into order number 3. So instead of being in the first element, it's just being added right to the end there as the order is being applied. So if we apply another order number, and if the order number is going to be greater than 3 to number 8, so let's do number 4, we see that element 8 now is after element 1, but because of the other elements on the page, they don't have an order being applied to them, so they're just buying by the default order, so they don't have any order numbers being applied to them. So going back to the parent, there's also a way to do a shorthand form. So instead of doing a flex wrap and a flex direction, there's a shorthand for that. So if we want to do flex wrap and flex column, we could do it this way, but the shorthand for it is the flex flow. And here you could do a column and a wrap all within one line of code, and that will remove out that need for the second line of code. So as you can see, it just displays it the same way. There's also a way to justify the content, which is how it gets aligned within the main axis. So this is going to be for the row and row wrap. So we can align and distribute the content whenever there's extra space. So in this example, we do see that there is some extra space. Especially when we're at 4, there is some spacing to the right-hand side. So we can update and define how that space, that extra leftover space, gets handled and managed. And that is done with the main container as well, where we can do the justify content. And justify content allows us to either to stretch it, to start it, to space it evenly. So the one that we're going to start with is just the flex start. So that's the default flex option. So that's just whatever the default is. There's also flex end, where items are put to the end of the available spacing. So that essentially moves them over to the right-hand side. But unlike the reverse for the row, it doesn't actually change the order of the elements that are being displayed. Remember, the only reason 1 and 8 are being changed in order is that they're being displayed here, down here below. So we can also comment out that order so that we've got 1 right at the top. And 1 is always the red box, blue is going to be the last one that we have. So we also have an option for the content to start. And what start does is it starts with whatever the direction mode is going to be. So it's pretty much the same as the flex start, which is the default. The end is going to be whatever the end writing mode is. So end is just going to simply justify the content. There's also an option for left. So that keeps the items to the left of the container. And then there's also right as well. So some of these seem fairly similar. Center actually centers the items. So this is a commonly used one, which allows you to center all of the children. There's also an option to set the space between and space around. So center is used quite often, and space, so it's going to be the space between, puts even spacing between the elements. So depending on how much size you have for the page, it's going to evenly distribute the elements across the available space area. So that's the space between, evenly distributes it. There's also space around, which distributes space around each one of the elements. So that's what space around looks like. And it treats them as separate elements, so applying the spacing around each one of those elements. There's also space evenly. So there are some of them, there are only very subtle differences, and it depends on how you've stacked the elements and the height of the elements. So currently all of our elements are within the same height, but if they were unequal heights, then you would see some difference here between the widths and the heights. And this is where Flex is doing the calculations to distribute them evenly. So space evenly, items are distributed, and the space in between any two items is going to always be equal. So save that and refresh it. So very similar effects within this case, but you might find, depending on how your elements are sized, that you might have some difference there. So let's actually apply some different heights to the page elements, and we'll see what we can see as being different. So might have some elements, and not always your elements are going to be the same. So that's where whenever we're doing the different flex options, we're going to see that they're automatically adjusting to whatever the longest one is. So that also distributes them nice and evenly as well. So with the flex start, that still distributes them evenly, but it pushes them over to the left-hand side. And I'm actually going to update the styling of a few other ones, the height of a few other ones, so we can really distinguish between the two. I don't need to set the color, but let's say this one is going to be 50 pixels. And so that one is quite a bit smaller. And number 3, we'll make this one 350 pixels. So once again, we see the distribution is done to whatever the largest element is. And because element number 3 has a height of 350, it's readjusting the size of the other ones the same way. If we do a flex end, it pushes it over to the right-hand side, but still uses the sizing the same way. So let's go back to the flex start. And now we're going to add in the align. So there's an option to align items. And again, this is done within the parent. So we've got a number of options here where we can stretch them, which is the default where we see the stretching of the heights. You can also center the heights. So if I do stretch, you're not going to see any different. But if we do center, it's going to automatically adjust the heights of the elements, and it's going to center it. And again, according to whatever the largest one is, that's where the centering occurs for those page elements. There's also the baseline. So what baseline does is it just aligns it to their baseline alignments, which doesn't look much different from the default. There's a flex start for this as well. And what flex start does is we're not going to see a difference, but the items are placed within the cross axis, so a different axis, and then the end, it puts them at the bottom, so the flex end brings the elements down to the bottom of the axis. And then so using the justify content or the align items, you also have an align content as well option. So what the align content does is it aligns the content with the extra space. So just as we've seen it with the space between, space around, stretch, center, flex end, and flex start options. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarities between justify content and different specific ways to justify the content. So most of the time, you're going to either see the justify content or you're going to see either one of these. So you're not going to see all three at the same time being applied. There's more information about the justify content, the Mozilla Developer Network. So it's the property that distributes the space around the content of the items. So it's got all of the most common uses here where center, the space between, space around, space evenly for the justify content. So it's got all of this information here on all the different options that you have for the justify content. And then more details about each one of what these properties do and how they're going to make the adjustments to the content that you've got within the page. So check it out, and most of the time you're only going to see that the justify content gets used, but you might also encounter the align items and the align content as well. So depending on what type of styling and what the needs are for the page and what styling is being applied for the page.